Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Sadi Het, a new Mishnah teaches, Hamocher yayin lachavero vehechmis, eno chaya ba'achariuto, vim yadua she'eno machmis, harezeh mikach ta'ut. Someone sells wine to his friend, and it turned into vinegar later on. We saw a case similar to this. So the Mishnah teaches that the seller is not responsible. At the time that he sold it, it was wine, it was drinkable, and it became vinegar afterwards. So the seller says, it's your problem, buyer, I am not paying you. However, if it's known that this seller's wine always turns into vinegar, it never lasts long, then that's a mistaken transaction. This is like buying new square milk. You know after 2 days, it always goes bad. So if this seller has a reputation like that, then he has to pay, because this is not just a one-off. Okay, sometimes it happens, it's in a batch, whatever. If this always happens, there's something wrong with his process, and therefore the seller has to pay the buyer back. V'im amar lo yayin mebusam ani mocher lecha, chayab la'amid lo ad ha'aseret. If the seller says, I'm selling you spiced wine that's well preserved and will last a long time, then it has to last at least until Shavuot. The reason is because after that is summertime, it gets hot, and it's hard for wine to be preserved over the summer. So the seller can't be responsible for it staying preserved over the summer, but it must stay good at least until Shavuot. V'yashan mishel eshtakad u'miyushan mishel shalosh shanim. If he says, I'm selling you old wine, then it has to be at least 1 year old. And if he says, I'm selling you miyushan wine, meaning very old wine, then it has to be at least 3 years old, which would be better quality. Of course, it has to last well and not spoil, but if it does last and it ages for 3 years, then that would be very good wine. If he is advertising it as such, then he has to deliver 3-year-old wine. אמר רבי יוסי ברבי חנינא, לא שנו אלא בקנקנים דלוקח, אבל בקנקנים דמוכר, אמר לה, החמרח והקנקנח. Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, teaches that the opening line of the Mishnah that says the seller is not responsible, that's only true if the seller puts the wine in the jug of the buyer. Then he's not responsible, because he says, listen, I delivered wine to you. At the time I delivered it, the wine was good. I poured it into your jug, Mr. Buyer, so this is your problem. Maybe your jug is bad and caused it to go sour. Not my problem. However, if the seller delivers it in his own jug, he delivers an entire jug full of wine, leaves it in that jug, then the buyer has a good claim. He can say, here is your wine and here is your jug. Take it back exactly the same way you gave it to me. And look now, I see shortly after you sold it to me, it is vinegar. So you know what? I'm just sending the whole thing back. Obviously, it's not my fault, the buyer says. It's your jug, so take it back. That's Rabbi Yosef's chidush. Now we ask about that. V'chi kankanin democher mai haveh le'male la'iba'e lach le'shahuyeh. We ask, even if it's the jugs of the seller, so what? Why does that make the seller responsible? The seller should also have a claim and say, you should not have left it for so long. I sold you the wine, it's in my jug, it's true, and it's good wine. You should have drunk it right away. At the time that I sold it, it was good wine. You, buyer, decided to leave it, put it in storage for a while. So I didn't say that you should put it in storage. I sold you good wine. Therefore, the question against Rabbi Yosef is, what's the difference whose jug it is? Whether it's the buyer's jug or the seller's jug, meaning even the seller's jug, the seller should say, I delivered good wine, and therefore, goodbye, it's your problem. And the answer is, La Siricha Damar Le Lemikpa. Oh, we're talking specifically about a case where the buyer says, I need it for cooking. Since he needs it for cooking, he's only going to be using a little bit at a time, and the expectation is he's going to put the rest in storage and use it over the next days, weeks, maybe even months. And so because the buyer said, I want it for storage, so then he has a right to expect that he's going to get wine that can last a long time. In that case where he said it is for cooking, then it makes a difference whose jug it's in. If it goes into the buyer's jug, then the seller says, oh, it's in your jug. Maybe your jug was bad, not my problem. But if the buyer said, I want it for cooking, and it was delivered in the seller's own jug, so the buyer didn't touch it, didn't do anything to it, and that went bad, so then that's a bad deal, and the seller has to pay the buyer back for it. Okay, so that was Rabbi Yosef. Now we ask, Mai duchke de Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina lokma lematnitin bekankanin de lokeach ve da amar le lemikpa lokma bekankanin de mocher u de la amar le lemikpa. What compelled Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina to limit the case of the Mishnah to where it was the jugs of the buyer, and the buyer said, I want it for cooking. And we said specifically in that case, even though the buyer said, I want it for cooking, and therefore we'd expect that he should get good wine that will last a long time, but because it was, and precisely because it was the jugs of the buyer, therefore the seller says, I'm not responsible, I put it in your jug was the problem. Why do you have to limit the case like that? The Mishnah doesn't say anything about that he said for cooking wine only, so you're adding a limitation that really forces the words of the Mishnah. We can have a simpler interpretation of the Mishnah. Why not say that the Mishnah is talking about the jugs of the seller, and it's a case where the buyer did not say it's for cooking? That sounds like it would be a standard case. If you don't say anything, then probably the buyer did not say anything and did not say he needs it for cooking. So in that case, that's when the seller is not responsible. It actually doesn't matter whose jug it is, and the Mishnah also didn't say whose jug it was. So whether it's the jug of the buyer, or even if it's the jug of the seller, because the buyer didn't say he needs it for cooking, the seller can assume that he's going to drink it right away. And therefore he has a good claim and says, listen, I sold you wine, I put it in my jug, I put it in your jug, it doesn't matter. But the wine, you could have drunk it right away. So it's not my problem that you decided to put it into storage and then it went bad. That would be an easier way to explain the Mishnah. And the answer is Amar Rava, Matitin Keshite. Rava says it's the continuation of this very Mishnah is what was difficult to Rabbi Yosef. Dekatane, im yadua sheyano machmis hareze mikach ta'ut. Amai, lemale la iba'e lach leshahuye. In the continuation it says, if it's known that this seller's wine always becomes vinegar, it's like new square milk, it always goes bad, then it's a mistaken transaction. Now why? Why can't the seller say, you should not have left it, you should not have put it in storage? It's true, my wine always goes bad after a couple of days. So who asked you to wait a couple of days? The new square guy can say, yeah, so what, our milk always goes bad. Don't you have a large family? You drink the whole bottle in one day. So who asked you to leave it for a long time? So that would have been a rightful claim. Why should it be a mistaken transaction just because this guy's wine always goes bad? He should be able to say, you should have drunk it right away. I sold it to you for immediate consumption. So we cannot understand the sefa. The only way to understand that clause is if the buyer said, I want to use it for cooking, I'm going to put it into storage. Since he said that, and this guy, his wine never stays good. It always goes bad in storage. That's why it's a mekach ta'ut. I asked you for storage wine, and you gave me wine, and your wine always goes bad. That explains that clause. It has to be where it's for cooking. If that clause is where the buyer asked for cooking wine, then the resha is also a case where the buyer asked for cooking wine. And so he says, I want cooking wine. Now, if he asked for cooking wine, why would the seller be not responsible? Remember, the resha, it says that the seller is not responsible. Oh, must be he's not responsible because, and only because, he put it in the jugs of the buyer. Even though the buyer asked for cooking wine, once it goes in the buyer's jugs, then the seller relinquishes responsibility. So far, we saw that Rabbi Yosef limits the case of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that the seller is not responsible, and Rabbi Yosef says, hold on, that's only true in some cases, but not in all cases. Ufeliga de Rav Chia bar Yosef, Tamar Rav Chia bar Yosef, Chamra, Mazala de Mare Garim, Shenemar, Vaf ki hayayin yayin boged geber yahir vegomer. The opinion of Rabbi Yosef above is in disagreement with that of Rav Chiya bar Yosef, because Rav Chiya bar Yosef says it's always the responsibility of the buyer, whoever owns it now. Once the buyer buys it, no matter what, he is responsible. Why? Because regarding wine, it's the luck of its owner that causes it to go bad. It's not because the seller made bad quality wine. It's not because it was in this jug or that jug. No. Once you own wine, then a person's actions and character traits, that's what determines whether the wine will stay good or go bad. As the pasuk in Habakkuk says, moreover, wine is a treacherous dealer, meaning wine goes bad. When does wine go bad? When is yayin boged? Gever yahir, when the owner is a haughty man. So, if the wine goes bad in the hands of the buyer, that means it's because the buyer is a haughty man and has nothing to do with the seller. So, Rav Chiya says, I read the Mishnah to mean across the board, that whenever someone sells wine to someone else, as long as at the time of delivery it was in fact wine, and then it goes bad afterwards, the seller is not responsible. That's what the Mishnah says. Rav Chiya says across the board. Doesn't matter why, because we know why. It's the haughtiness of the buyer. Amar Rav Mari, Hai man deyahir afilu נשה ביתה למקבל, שנאמר, גבר יהיר ולא ינווה, מאי ולא ינווה בנווה שלו. More on the theme of a haughty person, Rav Mari says, a person who is haughty, even the members of his household don't accept him. As the pasuk says, there's the continuation of that pasuk before, a haughty person does not abide. What do you mean does not abide? He does not live in his own home. Even his family members say, you're too haughty, we don't want you, get out. אמר רב יהודה אמר רב, כל המתגאה בטלית של תלמיד חכם ואינו תלמיד חכם, אין מכניסין אותו במחיסתו של הקדוש ברוך הוא, כתיבך ולא ינווה, וכתיבתם אל נווה קודשך. Another derasha from the same pasuk. Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, teaches, anyone who glorifies himself wearing the clothing of a sage. We saw once that sages have a distinctive clothing. It's very long and modest, and it's distinctive. It shows that they are a sage. Maybe like the robes or like the round hat that the chief rabbi wears. So anybody who wears such clothing and they are not worthy, they are not a scholar, then that person will never be able to enter into the boundary, the courtyard, together with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world to come. How do you know? Because it says V'lo yinveh, this haughty person will not abide. And what is that? Where else do we see this yinveh? El neveh kodshecha, Hashem's holy habitation. So where will he not be able to abide? Not only in his own house, but also in Hashem's abode. Amar Rava, Haiman dezaben lechabita dechamra lechen va'a, adata lesabuye, utkef apalga o tilta, dinahu dimkabel la mine. Rava teaches that if a person sells a barrel of wine to a shopkeeper on consignment, with the understanding that the shopkeeper is going to serve it and sell a certain amount, and so whatever he sells, so that he will pay for after the fact, and then the rest of it he'll sell another time in the future. Now, let's say he sells a certain amount and he has left over a half or a third and it goes bad. Well, in that case, he can just give back that half or that third, since he didn't pay for it up front. It's not like a regular sale where I buy a barrel from you, that's it. So now you're not responsible anymore, whatever happens. But in this case, I'm buying it on consignment. So really, I could return the leftovers at any time. I'm only paying you for what I use. So therefore, I used half. Now, half of it went bad. Okay, here it is back, right, in whatever state it's in. So the buyer does not have to pay for the value of wine. He can just give back the leftovers that turned into vinegar. But this is only true if the buyer, the shopkeeper, did not change the tap. But if he made a new hole to put a new tap, then if you put the tap in the wrong place, in the wrong way, then that can cause the wine to go bad. So if you change the tap, then we assume that it's the buyer's fault. The seller says, you caused it to go bad, and therefore you have to pay for the whole barrel. And furthermore, we only say that the buyer can give back the spoiled wine and doesn't have to pay for it if the market day has not yet arrived. But if the market day already arrived, then the buyer has to pay for the entire barrel, because we assume that when the market day comes, there's lots of customers, and as long as the shopkeeper would do a good job and not be lazy and go and sell it, he should have been able to sell the entire barrel, and in that case, the whole barrel would be sold and the seller would get all his money. The fact that half of it is still left over, even after market day, that means the shopkeeper was just lazy. So it's his fault that he waited so long and it went bad, and the seller can, in that case, also demand that the shopkeeper, pay for the entire barrel. Rava next teaches another law about partnerships. V'amar Rava, Haiman de kabil hamra adata de mamte le farvata de vol shefat. V'ademate hatam zal. Dinahu de mekabel le. If a person accepts upon himself wine, having in mind, meaning with the condition that he's going to sell it in the port called vol shefat. So you have a winemaker, he owns the wine, and he gets into a partnership with a middleman and says, listen, take this barrel of wine, you go and sell it in that port, and then bring back the profits, and we will share the profits. Fine, he accepts. Now, by the time he gets there, before he gets there, the price of wine in that port already goes down. This place is a port on the Tigris River. And the price goes down, and he cannot sell it anymore for a profit. So he brings it back. So who accepts the responsibility of that price loss? Or maybe he does sell it, but now he sells it at a loss. Either way, who accepts that responsibility? And the answer is the wine maker accepts the loss. Because what choice did the middleman have? It's not like he got there and waited and was lazy and didn't sell it right away. Even before he got there, already the price dropped. And so that's the winemaker retains ownership of it. Like the previous case, he gives it to him on consignment, and through no fault of the middleman, price went down and he couldn't sell it at a profit, so therefore the seller, the winemaker, has to accept the loss. They asked him, Hava hala mai. Now what if you have a similar case, but not that the price goes down, instead the wine turns into vinegar somewhere along the way, before he gets to the port, before he's able to sell it, turns into vinegar. Who takes responsibility? Amale Rav Hillel Rav Asher, ki havan be Rav Kahana amalan hala la udela kerebi and Rav Hillel told Rav Asher, when we were in the house of Rav Kahana, he told us that if it turns into vinegar, then this law is not the case, meaning that the middleman accepts responsibility. That means he is following the law of Rav Hama over here, Rav Chaya over here, that says that the buyer always accepts responsibility. It's his problem. He must have been haughty or something and caused that upon himself. And this disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, who said all the way in the beginning that if it's the jugs of the seller, and we'll assume here it's the jugs of the seller, then the seller is responsible when it goes bad. So we're not following Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. Instead, we're following the opinion of Rav Chaya that since it doesn't matter whose jug it's in, once it's in the hands of the buyer and it goes bad, it's the buyer's problem and he is responsible. There's another version of the answer that's exactly the opposite, that says even if it turns bad and spoils and turns into vinegar, also the owner, the winemaker, accepts responsibility. Who does this follow? It follows the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, who says, in fact, if it's still in the jugs of the seller, which we're assuming it is in this case, then the seller accepts responsibility when it goes bad, even though it's in the hands of the buyer, and so it would be the exact opposite of the previous version. Yashan Mishel Eshtaka. The Mishnah went on and said, if the seller advertised his wine as Yashan, as old, then it has to be at least 1 year old. We learn Tana umiyashen veholech ad hehag. This old wine that's sold has to stay good until the holiday of Sukkot. Usually grapes would ripen and be bottled sometime over the summer, and has to be 1 year old. So that means it's buying it at some time next year, maybe in the next summer, and has to last through the summer all the way until Sukkot, because that's the definition of old wine, that it should be a year old, a full year, even all the way until Sukkot. New Mishnah, a quick introduction. When a young man or a young woman were growing up, they would be living in their parents' home, within the same house. When a certain young man and young woman would get married, then the new couple would live in a bet chatanim that was provided by the groom's father, usually on his property. Let's say he had a big property, so he would take a section and he would have a house built for them, and they would live there. Or if he didn't have a lot of land, he would buy land nearby, and so that was provided by the boy's family. If he died during the marriage, then the wife would go back to her parents, and she wouldn't live in the same house with her parents. Once she's married, that would not be proper. Rather, her father would need to build her another home called a bet almanut, a widow's house. Now, this Mishnah is going to teach us some of the laws about building such homes. Hamocher makom lechavero, v'chen mekabel makom mechavero lasot lo bet חתנות לבנו ובית אלמנות לביתו. בונה 400 על 6. דברי רבי עקיבא. רבי ישמעאל אומר, רפת בקר היא זו. If someone sells a plot of land to his friend for the purpose of building such a home, or if a builder receives a plot of land and is told, can you build a home either for a new couple, this would be a bridal home, they would get married. As soon as they got married, they would go and live in that home, and the Sheva Berachot would be in that home. It could be a small home because they don't have children yet, so this is a nice starter house. And so if he's contracted to build such a thing, or if the husband dies and she has to go back to living with her parents, not with her parents, but her parents provide her a bet almanut, either way, the minimal dimensions are 4 by 6. So there has to be enough land that it can fit a 4 by 6 home, or the builder has to build a 4 by 6 home, according to Rabbi Akiba. Rabbi Yishmael, however, disagrees and says a 4 by 6 home, we're talking about 4 by 6 amot. So that's 1.5 feet for each. So that would be 6 by 8. That's not a house. That's a cowshed. It's too small. So Rabbi Yishmael says it would have to be bigger than that. Now, speaking of a cowshed, haroseh lasot refet bakar boneh 4 amot al 6. If someone says to a contractor, build me a cowshed, then it has to be at least 4 by 6. The Gemara will discuss who says this line. Is this Rabbi Akiba continuing, or Rabbi Yishmael continuing his words? Bayit katan 6 al 8. Now we'll have other definitions. If someone says, build me a small house, or he sells land for a small house, then it has to fit a house that's at least 6 by 8 amot. Gadol shemone al esed, a large house, that would be 8 by 10. Tedaklin esed al esed. If you say, build me a banquet hall, that would be 10 by 10. Can you imagine that's 15 feet by 15 feet? We would call that a medium-sized room, not even very big. But that's it. That's the whole house. The whole house is one room, 15 by 15, and that was already considered, wow, a big banquet hall. And how high does it have to be? You add up the length and the width, and you divide it in half, and that's how high it has to be. Which means that the ceilings actually would be pretty high if you consider a small house to be 6 by 8, so you add those together and you get 14, divided by 2 is 7, so that would be 7, that would be like a 10-foot ceiling, over a 10-foot ceiling for this little house. So it's true, when you have tall ceilings, even a small room can feel big. ראיה לדבר רבן שמעון בן גמליאל אומר כבניין ההיכל. And what's the proof for this? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says it's like the way that the sanctuary was built, because the sanctuary was 40 cubits wide, 20 cubits long, so add those together, you get 60. Half of that is 30. And that's how high it was. And so the home should be the same dimensions. This may be another reference to what we were talking about yesterday, that we try to bring the holiness of the Bet HaMikdash into our homes by using the same wine and the same types of wicks and oils for Shabbat candles and wine for Kiddush. And here, even the architecture of our homes should in some way match the architecture, at least the ratios of the Bet HaMikdash. Lama li limitna בית חתנות לבנו ובית אלמנות לביתו ולתנה בית חתנות לבנו ולביתו ובית אלמנות לבנו ולביתו. Now a language question. Why does the Mishnah say a bridal house for his son? Doesn't his son and someone's daughter also live there? And it only says a widowhood home for his daughter. Why doesn't the Mishnah say someone who builds a bridal home for his son or for his daughter? In other words, maybe the boy's family is building the home, maybe the girl's family is building the home. Wasn't that something that they would negotiate before the marriage? You build the home. No, I'll build the home. And furthermore, the widowhood home, well, wherever it was, whoever was building the bridal home, once that spouse died, then the living spouse would have to go and live to the other side. And so if the girl's family made the bridal home and they were living there, and then the girl died, so then the boy would have to go back to his parents, and his parents would have to build for him a widower's home. So why doesn't it say both? And the answer is because it's giving you the usual manner. It's not the way for a groom to go live with his in-laws, or even if his in-laws build them a home. That's not the normal procedure. Usually, when a couple gets married, it's the boy's family that provides the home. כדכתיב בספר בן סירה, הכל שקלתי בכף מאזניים, ולא מצאתי קל מסובין, וקל מסובין חתן הדר בבית חמיב. As it says in the book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a wise sage that lived sometime during the 2nd century BCE. This is a very old book that we actually have. We had it in Greek for a long time. It was preserved in Greek, and then in the Cairo Geniza, it was discovered in the original Hebrew. Quite an amazing thing. It's not part of Tanakh, but it kind of almost was part of Tanakh. It could have been, but it was written too late, so it passed the cutoff point to make it into Tanakh. But it was a very popular book, and in fact, so popular that the Talmud quotes it with the words Kid Dichtiv, the same language it uses for quoting a pasuk. So you see that the rabbis of the Talmud held Ben Sira in high esteem, even though it's one of the Sifarim Chitzonim, it's one of the outside books, not canonized as part of Tanakh. Nevertheless, this is one that the rabbis quote dozens of times in the Talmud. And it says in the book of Ben Sira that I weighed everything in a balance scale, and I found that the lightest thing in the world is bran. But you know what's lighter than bran, meaning less valuable, worse than bran? It's a groom who lives in the home of his in-laws. That's the worst thing. Okay, I have to admit I am guilty of this. In the summer times, I live with my in-laws, but only in the summers, so I'm only a little bit lighter than bran. But don't worry, there's something even lighter than that. Worse than that is a guest who invites another guest. Someone invited you as a guest, you go and bring 3 friends with you that you invited without telling the original host. משיב דבר בטרם ישמע, שנאמר, משיב דבר בטרם ישמע, איוולתי לא וכלימה. And even worse than a guest who invites a guest is someone who answers a question even before he listens to it. As it says in Pasuk in Mishle, he that gives an answer before he listens, it is folly for him and a disgrace. First, listen out to the person who's asking you something. Make sure you understand all the facets of the question that they're asking. Think about it carefully and only then give an answer. Don't just jump to an answer prematurely. Now, Rabbi Yishmael omer refet bakar hi zo, haroseh lasot v'chule. Rabbi Yishmael told Rabbi Akiba, 4x6, that's too small, that's a cowshed. And then the Mishnah went on and said, oh, by the way, a cowshed, how big is that? 4x6. Refet bakar man katani la. Who said this line that taught that how big a cowshed is? Ikadamar Rabbi Yishmael katani la, ikadamar Rabbi Akiba katani la. Some say it's a continuation of Rabbi Yishmael's words, and some say actually Rabbi Akiba is picking up on what Rabbi Ishmael said, Rabbi Ishmael, you mentioned the cowshed. I have something to say about a cowshed. It's 4x6. So let's explain both ways. Ika de amar Rabbi Akiva katanila. V'achi kamar. Afo pi sherefet bakar hi. Pamim shadam oseh dirato kerefet bakar. Some say Rabbi Akiva is saying this in response to Rabbi Ishmael. And he's saying, you're right. 4x6 is the size of a cowshed. But so what? Sometimes some people like a small, nice, cozy house. It's just one couple. They have no kids. They can always go to their parents for Friday night dinner. And so it's okay. Sometimes a person wants to make his home as small as a cowshed. And that's what he was answering to Rabbi Ishmael. V'ika de'amar Rabbi Ishmael katani la v'achi kamar she haroseh lasot refet bakar oseh arba amot al shesh. Some say it's a continuation of Rabbi Ishmael's words. Rabbi Akiva said, if you're making a home for the bride and groom, it has to be 4x6. Rabbi Ishmael says that's a cowshed because we learned that if you're going to make a cowshed, it has to be 4x6. So you see, that's too small, and it's actually Rabbi Ishmael's words, and he said them against Rabbi Akiva. Teraklin as eser al eser. My teraklin kubeta bevardeh. Says a banquet hall is 10 by 10. What is a banquet hall? It's a pavilion of roses. Taneh ve'kanter shetem esre al shetem esre. My kanter tarbas apedane. There's a braita that says a kanter is 12 by 12. If you tell a builder, build me a kanter, it's got to be 12 by 12 amot. What is a kanter? It's a decorative courtyard of a mansion. Rumo kechasi orko uchasi rochbo. Ra'ya ledavar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer kibinyan ha'hechal. The end of the Mishnah says that whatever you're building, the height has to be, you take the length plus the width, and divide it in half, and that is the height. And then it says, a proof of the matter. What's the proof of the matter? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says it's the same as the sanctuary of the Bet HaMikdash. We ask a language question. Re'aya ledavar. Man katani la. These words, Re'aya ledavar. Who says those words? There's two options. Ika damar. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel katani la. V'achi kamar. Re'aya ledavar minayin. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Hakol kibinyan ha'echal. So some say it's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He himself said those words. In other words, there was a halacha that says this is how high it has to be. And then we said, what's the proof? How do you know that? And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, I know the proof. And he brought a proof to support Tanakama. Very good. V'ika damar Tanakama katanila. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel at itamuhi ka metama. V'achi kamar le Tanakama. Re'aya minayin mebinyan hechal atu kule alma kebinyan hechal abde. Some say actually that Tanakama is the one that brought the proof in the first place. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is asking a question or expressing astonishment about that proof. So the Tanakama says, what is the height? The length plus the width divided in half, and that would be the same as the sanctuary. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying, is that where you learn it from? What's the proof from the Bet HaMikdash? What, do you think everybody can build something that's like the Bet HaMikdash? Bet HaMikdash is a special, very grand building. That's why it has a very, very high ceiling. You can't expect that everybody should have such a high ceiling, even though actually it's not as high, but in terms of ratio, it would be the same ratio. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is actually disagreeing with Tanakama and saying, no, it does not need to be that high. Tanya, acherim omrim rumo kekorotav. There's a braita that has another opinion that doesn't have to be the length plus the width divided by 2, but rather the height is the same as the length of the crossbeam. That's it, the length of the crossbeam. So just one way, that's the same as the height. We ask a language question, Velema rumo kerochbo. Why not just say that the height is the same as the width? Why are you saying it's the same as the cross beam? Why the beam? Just say the width of the house measuring from the floor. Why the length of the beam? Two reasons. Ibayetema beta me'ila'e ravcha. Ibayetema mishum de'ika be kaveh. Some two answers. One is because a house widens at the top. The reason is when you build a wall, the bottom of the wall is very thick, and then it tapers down and gets thinner up above. Therefore, the cross beams on top are actually longer than the width of the floor. So he said the length of the cross beam, which is actually a little bit longer than the width as measured on the floor. Or another answer is because there are indentations into the wall that the cross beam beams fit into. So the crossbeam is actually a little bit longer than the space, the width as measured on the floor, because they have to go into those holes. And so, so it could be for that reason that Acherim say that the height has to be the same as the cross beams to add those extra inches to the height, that it should be even a little bit longer than the length as measured from the floor. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'amen.